Good evening, everyone. All right, the mic works. Thank you all very much for coming. We appreciate your joining us tonight. We look forward to your participation. This evening, we will start with a presentation that's going to introduce some concepts and some ideas associated with the zoning code, design standards, those types of things. And then we're going to transition into kind of an interactive exercise that you'll be able to use your smartphones for if you want. We also have paper copies that will be made available when we get to that part of the meeting. And then that's the way that others that are viewing us from home will also be able to participate simultaneously. Again, we have paper copies for those that are here. If there's anyone watching at home that is not able to utilize a smartphone to participate, you can come in tomorrow and we will give you a hard copy that you can fill out of some of the surveys and things like that. We're very excited to get your feedback on this process. We really want you to talk to us about what you like, what you don't like, and help us get to a good place with this zoning code. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Monica Sidlick, who's going to kick us off this evening. And we'll go from there. Thank you. Oh, there is a sign-in sheet. So if you have not signed in when you came in, if you would, before you leave, if you wouldn't mind giving us your name, that would be great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Alexa. I'd also like to mention next to the sign-in sheet is an evaluation form. If you could take one of those with you. How's that?
That's not much better.
Okay. Let me cut a little closer. How about this? Does that work? Okay, great. Thank you for that, Alexa. I'd also like to mention that right next to the sign-in sheet is a little half-page evaluation form. If you can fill that out and leave that with a planning team member before you leave tonight, that would be very helpful to us. I'm Monica Sidlick from Lisa Wise Consulting. I'm joined by David Bergman, director at Lisa Wise Consulting, and Andrew Davidoff. And we're here with the City of Seal Beach planning team, and we are tonight going to review public review draft zoning amendments. So we'll go a little bit more into what that means. But we want to say thank you to everybody for joining us tonight. So a brief overview of tonight's workshop. We'll provide an overview of the project, the work that we're doing for the City of Seal Beach. The public review draft zoning amendments have been released. They're available on the city's website. We'll be presenting those to you so that as you leaf through the zoning amendments on your own, you'll have some context, a little bit of background about sort of what it is you're looking at. We also have, as Alexa mentioned, live polling. So we can get some targeted feedback from all of you, and following that, a discussion, and then a quick wrap-up. Thank you. So we began this project back in the spring of 2022. You can see we conducted some stakeholder interviews to hear from community members with some knowledge of or interest in the development site, the opportunity sites we're looking for. We drafted and finalized a technical analysis and recommendations memo. We presented those findings at our analysis and recommendations to the Planning Commission in April of this year. We got a lot of great feedback. We prepared an admin draft, zoning amendments document. We reviewed that with various city departments and city staff. And then we prepared the public review draft, and that's the draft that's available to you on the website. So I'd also like to note that what we're sharing with you tonight is part of an effort that is separate from, but related to the housing element. So to put it simply, the housing element calls for certain updates to your zoning code. And that's what we've prepared, and we are here to discuss with you. So we're not discussing whether the updates should occur to the housing element, because that's policy direction that's established in the housing element. On that note, should you have questions about the housing element, those comments can be delivered to city staff. Okay, so next slide, thank you. So a bit more on the occasion for this project. We'll take a quick look at some recent state legislation having to do with housing. Generally, there's far too many recent state housing bills, recent legislation to put on a slide or to put on 10 slides. There's a flood of legislation in the past 10 years and more even this week. But we've just thrown a few on this slide here. So a lot of them have to do with streamlining housing development, facilitating the development of affordable housing, some legislation specific to housing elements, some that are specific to certain development standards like parking. A recent one allows a developer to develop residential development, residential only, even on commercial corridors with conditions. But the zoning amendments that we are working with the city on, and which we're working with all of you on to prepare and sharing tonight, is really in direct response to a few key pieces of legislation. So here in the middle, we've listed SB 330. This prohibits Seal Beach or any other city from adopting new non-objective standards for residential or residential mixed-use projects, reducing allowed capacity through regulatory barriers, and denying any projects on the basis of subjective standards.
Monica, can you maybe explain what objective design standards are?
I will. So that is to say, when we prepare these zoning amendments to implement your housing element, we have to make sure that all of the standards that we introduce are objective in nature. They're measurable, they're verifiable, they're knowable. They don't rely on any personal judgment. A bit more about that in a moment. So the next slide, let's just talk about what we call ODS, Objective Design Standards in general. Cities all over California are developing these. So what we like to say is you can't regulate what you can't identify. That's why we reach out to the community. We talk about development that you like or dislike, what it is about development that you'd like to see in your community, what you wouldn't like to see. So part of our work that we've done so far is really to identify what are the existing patterns of development? What are the community desires? What does your code already address? What is it missing? What else might we want to see? How detailed do you want to get as a community for these objective design standards? And the thing to remember is because of SB 330, what that means, no subjective standards, what that means is there's no discretionary review for multifamily or residential mixed-use projects for anything with more than one unit. There's no discretionary review, which means no design review, no sort of discussing the project with the Planning Commission and sort of getting it through that way, because that's based on individual's evaluation and sort of subjective individual's judgment. So ultimately, the standards need to be objective, and that's an opportunity for communities to say what they want. Ultimately, the standards should enforce excellence in design, sensitive planning, compatibility, and design that's high quality and that's also predictable. You know what you'll get. This is the opportunity to identify that. So specifically here in Seal Beach, we are assisting in the preparation, drafting and adopting zoning amendments for a new zone that your housing element specifically calls for. We're calling it MCRHD. We're identifying uses that are allowed in this zone, the basic development standards, which we'll go through, and then the ODS, the design standards we were talking about. We're testing them out on the sites that are identified in the housing element, and we're talking about them with you and making sure that they address all of the community's concerns and that we take the time to fine-tune them. Next up, so we're operating within an existing policy framework, existing planning documents in your community, the housing element, which you're familiar with, so new goals and policies. So goal 1, program 1B is to facilitate the development of a variety of housing types for all income levels to meet the existing and future needs of residents. And Program 1B is create a mixed-use zone that meets state requirements for the RHNA sites, regional housing needs allocations, to allow a minimum residential density of 20 units an acre and maximum of 46 units an acre on larger development sites. And it goes on. But generally speaking, these are our marching orders, right? The housing element also, I'm going to read a couple of other goals because they were really, really directed our work. To address and where appropriate and legally possible, remove governmental constraints to the maintenance, improvement, and development of housing. And goal 4, to maintain and enhance the quality of residential neighborhoods in Seal Beach. And then going on, your general plan and the land use and community design elements also include policies that are our marching orders that guide our work. We've got the airport environs land use plan that tells us, okay, where identifies height limits, height constraints, and also constraints related to noise. We have to make sure we comply with that. We're also looking at the California Coastal Commission regulations, making sure that the standards that we introduce comply with all of these. Which is to say, we're not getting in the way of the existing regulatory framework. Next site. So these are the sites we're looking at, and you're familiar with these because these are the housing element sites that the community has discussed and that are published in the housing element. So specifically, the sites that we're recommending be rezoned to MCRHD are up there. The Shops at Rossmore, that's 27 acres, a total of 3 parcels. The Old Town Ranch Center, which is 26 acres, a total of 8 separate parcels. Seal Beach Plaza Village, 7 acres, a total of 5 parcels. Accurate Self-Storage, 4 acres. And Seal Beach Center, 9 acres. That's a total of 73 acres.
Mona, if I could jump in real quick, just for clarification, these are not all of our housing element sites, so anyone that's following it will notice not all of them are there, and that's because not all of our sites will be treated the same. Some of our sites don't need to be rezoned at all, or some will be rezoned differently. Our goal tonight is really to talk about our mixed-use residential zone that will be new to our zoning code. This is a brand new thing that we'll be implementing, so that's really our focus for this evening.
Thank you, Alexa. Yes, the sites that will be rezoned to our new zone that we're introducing into the code and providing standards for. So let's talk a little bit about that MCRHD zone. As we remember from the housing element policy or program, it must accommodate up to 46 units an acre. So here is, this text is very small. 46, a maximum of, yes. And that's what was needed to meet the RHNA numbers. Okay, so this text is very small, but this is your zoning code. You'll notice that there's a couple of lines of orange text. What we've done is just pointed out, this is where the amendments go. We didn't touch anything else. We added the new zone, the MCRHD, just to the whole list of zones up at the top in the general provisions. We made a couple of minor amendments to the rules of measurement, nothing really substantive, and also to the use classifications over in Part 4. Just update the code. This is also an opportunity to make little fixes and updates where appropriate. But the bulk of the material that we're introducing into the code is there in Part 2. So there's already a chapter, 11.2.10, for commercial and mixed-use districts. We've just slid another zone into that section. So let's go through, and we'll go through fairly quickly the new content, what we're introducing into the zoning code. So starting with uses. So let's talk about some existing zones you already have in the code. You've already got a high density residential. the housing development that abuts the shops at Rossmore up in that northern Seal Beach area, that's RH 46. It's an existing zone you already have. So we looked at that to say, well, what's allowed? What are the standards and the uses here? And then we looked at LC, our LCRMD. That's an existing zone you already have. We're not touching that area, but it's limited commercial residential medium density. So if you sort of put these two together, you've got high density, you've got commercial medium density. What we're doing is creating a zone that's residential high density with some commercial. So we thought about if you sort of put those together, that's a starting point. So they're generally consistent with these two zones smashed together. And then we modified it from there to meet all of the housing elements policies and make it just right. So here are some uses that are allowed by right, of course, residential, and then some limited non-residential. With a minor use permit, you can get a little bit, the non-residential can sort of move outward a little bit more flexible, some outdoor dining, some commercial recreation, some offices. If you have a conditional use permit, you can go even further with the non-res uses. But generally speaking, the intent of this zone is to support multifamily, senior housing, residential care facilities with some limited commercial. Next up. So next we'll talk about the basic development standards. So sort of like the uses, we looked at the basic development standards for the RH 46, the high density zone that you already have, and we looked at the basic development standards for the mixed use with medium density. We also looked at what's already allowed on these sites. So these sites right now, they're zoned generally GC, general commercial, or SC, service commercial. So that's different, but it's worth it to look at what is the form of building that's allowed on that site. Again, going back to neighborhood context, and if those sites were to build out before the rezoning, how big could they be? We want to acknowledge that. So we look at what's allowed on those sites currently, given their existing zoning. We looked at what the housing element requires, 46 units an acre. We looked at the standards for the high density district you already have. We looked at context. So put simply, we developed standards that would best accommodate the required intensity of development in a way that the community would hopefully find the most palatable and see as the most sensitive to its context. So what do we need to accommodate? You can see 46 units an acre. We established a maximum non-residential FAR of 0.9, and the height can go a little bit higher outside of the coastal zone, an extra story. And then measure height a little bit differently in the flood zone. That's pretty typical. Next slide, some more development standards. So we landed at these setbacks, side and rear setbacks that are, as I mentioned, pretty consistent with this intensity of development elsewhere in the city. And then street-facing setbacks to allow improvements, landscaping, building to street relationship, articulation of the ground floor. We'll get into that a little bit more on the slides to come. And then upper story step backs. Part of the outreach we've done is we heard that the transitions between intense development and neighboring or perhaps facing lower intensity development are a concern for the community. So we thought about how we could require upper stories to be stepped back. So understand that the development standards, these basic development standards are sort of trade-offs. So with shallower required setbacks from the property line and less building articulation on upper stories, you can get the same development capacity in fewer overall stories. So it's always a bit of a trade-off, and that's what we're presenting to you here to see if we've sort of gotten that, hit that right. Let's move on to the design standards. I'd also like to note that not all of the design standards that we're introducing are new. You have design standards in your code. So and if you look at the amendments, in a lot of cases we're adding on to what you have, or we're taking standards that you already have for some of these zones and applying them to the new zone. So not all of this is new material. But for this MCRHD, we took this requirement that you have for another zone about public open space being required for buildings over 25,000 square feet. We thought that was reasonable for this zone. Some more requirements about landscaping, how much the front yard must be landscaped, how much paving you can have, and then some additional open space standards for residential only requirements, residential only development. Again, these are fairly consistent with the standards you have for similar development in other zones in the city. Next up, so parking design and parking configuration really, as we know, as you all know, it really drives the form of all multifamily development. So we want to get some standards that really speak to access and configuration of parking. So we've introduced some standards that we talk about the ways parking could be configured, whether a shared garage or tuck under or wrapped. Some standards about visibility of parking. Some standards about access, whether it can be accessed on major rights of way or if there's an alley. The idea is to minimize the visual impact of parking from rights of way. Next slide. So looking at building facades, we introduced some standards for projections. Again, a trade-off. So we wanted to allow flexibility in building and facade design, to lend character to buildings, and sort of a range of architectural styles to be expressed. We also wanted to provide residential privacy and maintain enough sort of area for the public realm of the streetscape, and also allow sufficient outdoor open space. So these are new standards for the new zone. Yes.
Those are notional pictures of
Yeah.
the designs? No, but, you know, a lot of the new developments are more modern, urban kind, looking, where this looks more like it suits you.
We're gonna have an opportunity to get your opinion on those as we move forward.
I'm just asking about the picture.
Yeah. We mentioned that the polling, we do inquire about architectural style, and that's something that we can address more or less in the standards, and we do want to hear from you all about your thoughts on architectural style, and if there's a particular style that is right for Seal Beach or that has no place in Seal Beach. We want to know these things. Next slide. We also introduced some standards for articulation based on facade length. So this text here is small, but generally the standards require certain sort of changes in facade depth based on length to require a certain play of light and shadow and visual interest in building facades. And roof form. We recommended standards that essentially prevent featureless or tacked on roofs, requiring roof form to generally correspond to the spaces beneath as a sort of best practice about design. Next up, we've got entrances. Entrances are what really establish that permeable interface between residential mixed use, multifamily development, and the public realm to make sure that the development feels inviting and there's some transparency and it contributes to an engaging street frontage. So we have some standards about sort of the frequency of entrances and protection, so that there's some protection from the elements. And then on the next slide, we get a little more prescriptive about entrances. This is more prescriptive than what's currently in anything in your code. For new residential, multifamily residential, and mixed use, we recommend requiring sort of one of these frontage types. There's a lot of flexibility within these standards, but it ensures that we don't have blank facades and that somebody walking by feels that they understand what's happening on the property that they're walking by and that there's some sort of permeability there. Also better designed for the occupants of the building. Next up, we introduce standards for ground floor design to make sure that the ground floor doesn't feel too shrimpy, essentially, compared to the upper stories. Standards for window and door design to make sure they're high quality and provide enough depth. And last up, we have some standards related to site design, lighting and signage. Again, there are sections in your code that address lighting and that address signage, but we've introduced a few that apply just to our new zone to make sure that we get the quality just right for our new zone. And that is the end of our brief summary of the zoning amendments that we're recommending for the introduction of this new zone to apply to these 5 areas. So at this time, we'd like to invite everybody to participate in a series of questions. It's a live poll. If you can sort of get there with this QR code, Andrew's going to show the questions. And we'll give you a little bit of time to interact with each question. Oh, I think we want to go back to, yeah. And then there we go. Oh, wait. There we go. And if you go to the next one.
Well, just to give people time to use the
code.
So for those of you that aren't familiar, use your camera function if you have one to scan that code, and that will take you to the polling. We have handouts of it. We also have paper handouts for people who don't have copies of it, so we'll distribute those.
Would anyone like a paper copy of the questions? Okay.
Well, yeah, no, paper, yeah. She's got it. Thank you. If I could, thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet. Absolutely. Pardon me.
I don't know. So now what I do is.
Yeah, but that's how you answer it.
Does anyone want an up-close QR code?
Yes, because it doesn't work. What do you do when you get there?
Well, what they should be starting, when they start it,
Something will happen.
They haven't been exposed to this information.
I don't know that I could have done it.
Talking about a highly technical topic, and it's the first time people are exposed to it. It's a hard to talk about material. It's totally fine. It's totally fine. It's just,
Okay.
it's.
Right. No, I hear you.
general.
I hear you.
Nope, didn't. That's the way, man. How do we fill this out? This is.
So, just by a quick show of hands, who's been able to get into this?
Nope.
That's all you want, is the
That's
front
it.
page right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're at the front page.
Once Andrew advances the slides, your phone will respond. Will do the same.
They mark it up.
But they'll have to do it in the white space, but we're going to go through they'll have to follow along with us.
Yeah.
Taking me to
All right, I'm gonna try to put our RDS password up here for the Wi-Fi.
the Wi-Fi here.
Okay. I see that. I see that. I saw that. Yeah. Is it repeating myself too much?
Yes.
It's a lot.
Is why design standards is because I don't think it's common understanding.
Oh, okay.
Right. Like what is not
No, I don't have, I don't think,
discriminatory standards.
I don't think so. I don't believe in them.
Yeah.
I don't have the act, and I don't want the act.
It's good.
Okay.
It's good.
Okay, again, so now we have people, we've got a chance to get on the city's Wi-Fi, but just by show of hands, are people who've been able to get to that first opening page? Okay. How about I ask the other way? Who's having trouble and would like help? No one? No one would like help, but you might be having trouble. I understand.
I've got somebody that asked me to sign up for a plan.
Yeah.
Okay. I can find the
Okay, well, it should start to become apparent as we do this, and so the first thing we're going to do here is, why don't you go to the first slide here. So here's an opportunity, right? It should show up on your phone, an icebreaker. What do you like most about Seal Beach? Right, so you have an opportunity to write in on your paper if you have it in front of you, but you also have an opportunity to write what you like about it.
A word or a phrase. I think it's. Yeah, enter a word or a phrase. I think it's about 100-character limit, so I'm not looking for an essay, but just throw some words out there about what you love about your city.
And then when you hit submit, it'll begin to populate. There we go.
These responses will be recorded as well, so when they disappear, we'll still have a record of them. Okay, I see the word small at least 4 times. That's great. I see both small and quaint and local. I think I notice a pattern with these responses. It's moving fast, right? So what we'll do is we'll give it another 10 seconds, and you can type in ideas, and then we'll stop, and we'll just have a look at the responses. This will help inform the whole discussion tonight.
Is there going to be a point where we can actually ask questions?
Certainly.
Yes.
Okay, so we see that we love the fact that it's walkable, that it's a small town, that it feels local. Looks like there's a lot of, we value the local businesses, local restaurants. I'm glad to see the people. We love the people here. Great. So we're gonna stop on this question and move on to the next.
So we have about 22 respondents. So generally, when we hit around that range, we'll know that we've heard from most people. Is there anybody who's not been able to respond, who's wanted to? Would you like help? Would you like
Let's-
some help?
Okay.
So why don't you move on to the next slide, and I'll assist this person.
And then it looks like this lady in the green shirt might need a hand. So these we want to know who's here. And this includes everybody participating from home and everybody here. You can respond to more than one question. You do live in, or more than one response. I live in Seal Beach, I work in Seal Beach, I work in lots of places, including Seal Beach. I go to school.
Doing half of Seal Beach a disservice with these questions, because there is a totally different feel from this part of Seal Beach, from the part of Seal Beach above the freeway.
So that's great. We're going to have an opportunity, once we have gone through and collected everybody's opinion, to have an open discussion. And at that point, we really want to understand the differences between the sites. We're going to talk about each of the sites in depth. So I'm asking you to trust the fact that we care about your community, that we've been working here for about 1.5 years, that we want to hear what you want to say, but we need to hear about it in a structured way so that we can accurately reflect it in the work we produce. So we do have a structure for tonight's program, and we have a presentation of our work of the public review draft. It was a little bit technical, I understand that, but it's available for you to review online, the public review draft of questions. This is to get a sense of feedback about the group, and we're going to start talking about sites. When we're done with this formal part of this, we're going to open it up for a discussion about the specific characteristics of the sites where the city is proposing to introduce a new zoning classification. So I know there's a lot of concern, but we're asking you to trust us that we want to reflect your concern as comprehensively, as accurately, and fully as possible.
Can I just ask a simple question? Tonight, are you voting on anything or just getting feedback?
We're presenting a public review draft. A public review draft allows the community as a whole to look at a potential modification to the city's zoning code that would be an amendment to the municipal code that would need to be adopted legislatively.
Nothing will be voted on or adopted tonight. This is not a reading. It's not a hearing. We're here to hear you, to get your feedback. And this is one way that we're trying to receive your feedback in a very structured way so that it's most useful to the next draft of standards.
How many people did you reach out to and what names? I mean, there are what, 40 people there, TV, but how, what?
Sure. We reached out utilizing all the channels that we have available to us. So we published notification in the paper. We did a press release. We utilized our social media accounts. We announced this meeting at other meetings. We did our very best to share it around. I know a number of our council members that put out newsletters or do their own posting also announced this meeting. So we were doing our very best to get the word out with everything available to us.
Well, our next question addresses that. Let's go to the next question. Okay, so we see we've got 21 responses. Right, 21 live in Seal Beach, a total of 31. Okay, if we go to the next question, we can see who's here. How many of us are here? And you can tell us whether you're here in person or virtually, and then we'll add to that any hands that you raise if you're not indicating that you're here virtually, and that way we'll get a real count. Oh, does this have a count? 27. Okay, 29. Let's see.
So we've had 29 responses, and then paper responses. I think we had about 6 of those
Okay.
circulated as well.
Okay. So this is nice. About a quarter of us we can't see. They're participating from home virtually.
Do you have a number?
Oh, that says 31. So 31 plus, I'm sorry, if you're here but you're not participating via your smartphone, can you raise your hand? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 12. Okay. So 31 plus 12? Okay, that's 43.
43 people, of which 33 are in the room.
Okay, and it just went up by 1, so that's good. Okay, next up. So what brought you to tonight's workshop? If you're looking at the screen, I'm gonna read these so that, because I know the text is a little bit small. I've been following the housing element update process. I'm excited about new development in Seal Beach. I have reservations about new development in Seal Beach. I want to know more about the design and quality of new buildings in Seal Beach. You don't have to select just one answer. You can select as many apply.
No, you can't go back. Oh, yes, you can.
Okay, so of the 32 virtual participants, we've got 27 right now, 28. Looks like the majority has reservations about new development in Seal Beach. We want to know more about what those are. It looks like about half have been following the housing element process, so you're informed about the occasion for this project, right? It looks like a lot of you want to know more about design, so we can talk more about some of the elements that are in the public review draft. What are those design elements and how are we regulating them? And most importantly, what would you like them to be? I'm glad that we have some who are excited about new development. We've got another category. We'll have an opportunity to hear what that means, what brought you here. Okay, let's move on to the next. And all 32 responded, thank you. Okay, so we're amending the zoning code. It's sort of a technical document. It's online, right? There's paper copies of it in City Hall. But we want to know, do you know what this document is? Do you use it? Do you look in it? How familiar are you with it? Okay, this is a really nice distribution. I mean, it looks like some of you might have been a little bit confused when we talked about the different parts of the code and where we're going in and adding things and the kinds of language we use in zoning codes. But it looks like some of you are saying, I know it's in my code, so this is great. It just means that we want to provide you with the information that'll help everyone lend their input into these draft standards. Great, thank you. Next up. Okay, so we've got some, so as we talked about, the new zone is mixed commercial, high density, mixed commercial, high density residential. Okay, so that's mixed, so it's got some non-residential components. But some of that mixed might be sort of what we call a horizontal mixed use as opposed to vertical mixed use, which means non-res here, residential here, rather than stacked. So what we're getting at is there's all kinds of product types, development types, configurations of multifamily housing that new development could take. One of those configurations, one of those housing types is townhomes. So here are some examples of development that I think a lot of us would consider these to be townhomes. That term, it's maybe means different things to different people. But generally speaking, you've got units side by side. Townhomes look all kinds of different ways. Not just these 4 images, but here are 4 examples. We want to know what you like.
And don't worry, we're going to ask why.
Yeah,
Leave it
absolutely.
Leave it
There's only 13 respondents so far, so that tells us that we've got some nuns, right? It places it as your first, and then you put your second. It might take a minute to get your order right. Great. It looks like we've got some front runners. So B and D. D is really contemporary looking. Those are almost tied. So B looks a little bit smaller scale, a little bit more sort of evokes a single family home, a little bit, I'd say more than the others. It's interesting that C is also contemporary design. Of course, it's got another story there. Okay, that's really good to know. We'd like to hear more about your thoughts on these designs when we get there. Let's move on to the next. Oh no, I'm sorry. Right. Okay, here we go. Which features are most important to you in assigning your rankings? So if we can go. Oh, this is a word cloud again. Right.
So it's open-ended. You can say you like that it's two-story. Yes.
Right.
Is that great word you used for the front, or the facades being different? You had a great word for that. Started with a V.
Variation? Variegated?
I like that.
Yeah, see, it's those facades are a little flatter, aren't they? I mean, there's still some relief, some depth, but less so.
We're
Okay.
getting a lot of comments about the fact that it's two-story, and I presume that it's limited to two-story, which is the ones that were selected. A lot of comments about landscaping, which is important and will be featured in the code, and comments about how it relates to the street. So this is really important information for us.
But if you went with two-story, are you gonna be able to meet the requirement of square
We're gonna find a way to make that work out if
per
we can.
acreage?
If we can, we're gonna go through each site.
Right. And there's the height of a building. There's also sort of the perceived height of a building, what you can do to sort of minimize how massive a building feels. So it's important if we see, oh, this is 2 stories, I see 2 stories, it's helpful information to know. And then also I see some of these deal with the space between the building and the sidewalk, the setback, the landscaping. That can do a lot to minimize the perceived bulk of a building. So all of these factors work together, but it's helpful to sort of stop and think about what it is about each example that occurs to you is something that affects your feelings about it. I noticed somebody would put parking. I think it's interesting that these all seem to have parking to the rear. We don't see garage doors sort of dominating the frontage. Okay, let's move on to the next. Parking could be impacted, that's true. Okay, let's move on to the next set of images. So these are multifamily. We wouldn't consider these townhomes. Yes, ma'am.
Will you have an elevator in these tall buildings?
Well, so that gets to sort of ADA requirements, and that's really building code. So if a building, that's sort of outside of our scope.
If it's required by the building code, then there'll be elevators. If it's not required by the,
If you have a 5-story apartment building,
that would be required if it were 5 stories, but I don't think any of these are being.
So in other
Well,
words,
they will
handicapped
be.
people couldn't live there.
Well, it's not allowable. You can't build a building that doesn't have enough ADA access. I mean, I don't know the exact requirements, but yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we see there's only 13, 14 responses. So that tells us something. All right. Okay, the C is it's multifamily. It's actually flex space, live work. So that's interesting that's as these have been changing, that's been the least favored all along. So that's good to know. It's also right at the sidewalk, whereas the other ones are a little bit set back. Okay, and you like B. B seems to be the clear front runner. That's got a lot of building articulation, a lot of landscaping at the building base. The ground floor is elevated above the sidewalk. It's not right there at the level of the sidewalk, and that adds something. Great, so keep these images in mind, and the next question you can type in. I'm just noticing some things that I'm saying out loud, but you're noticing what you're noticing about these buildings. So in the next question, add those words or phrases. So I should note, in developments like these, it's most likely, and for these certainly, that parking is like in a shared garage. Sometimes it's under like a podium, like if the development is slightly raised. The one on A could have individually secured garages on another side of the development. But typically, multifamily development has shared garages. Okay, so we're seeing, again, about some responses about landscaping, open space, the setback, building articulation. We see consistently support for 2 stories. 2 stories is most typical in Seal Beach, and certainly some new development may take that form. We have to be conscious of the fact that a higher density is allowed, And in order to achieve that, it's likely that a building would be more than 2 stories. So if and when that's the case, we want to make sure that the design standards help sort of sculpt the building in ways that the community would support.
We're ready
Great.
to move on?
These are mixed use. So there's multifamily residential with some non-residential. Ground floor commercial, office, but a mix of uses. So rank them again. And this is the last of this type of question. So the balance between the amount of sort of building area that's non-residential versus residential is of course different in all of these cases, and sort of how prominent the non-residential component is varies, and you know what we're trying to get at is we want to know what you like, what's appropriate to specifically these sites that we're looking at, Seal Beach Center, and you know, yeah, yes, ma'am.
Question, are you gonna ask us what we didn't like?
We're going to have an opportunity to talk about what works and what doesn't work.
Part of this.
Great. So D, that's got office. So that's interesting. It's got a lot of landscaping. It's got a lot of articulation. The non-residential component doesn't really look formally very different from the residential. It sort of blends in together. So I think it's interesting that's popular. I also think it's interesting that the least popular is C. And I would say that in that example, the parking is a little bit more prominent, more visually sort of part of what you see.
That's probably not what it is, it's probably that there are no balconies.
No balconies? Okay, great. Okay, great. Let's move on to the next. I would expect balconies might feature in the word cloud here. Great. So I see inviting retail. I think transparency at the ground level is good for, of course, for keeping the spaces occupied and having an engaging street frontage and streetscape. I see contemporary up there. I would like to know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. We'd like to hear more about that in a moment. It looks like size and height are consistently a concern. Okay. This is all helpful feedback. All right, next up. So the next series of slides, we're gonna look at if you remember the slide that had a map and it showed the sites that we're looking at, the sites that the housing element identifies as being to be rezoned as the mixed commercial, high density residential. So we're gonna look at 4 of those. So 2 of them are across the street from one another here. So we've got the shops at Rossmore and the Old Ranch Town Center. So just if you can kind of place yourself there right now. We've got some images on the left to remind everyone of these 2 sites. Okay, does anyone need a little bit of help orienting, like where we're talking about, where in the city? No, okay, let's move on to the next.
Ralph's on the right and Cole's on the left.
There's like a Sprouts or something? Yeah, yeah. All right, what works? What do you like?
Red boxes are,
Those are parcels. Those are parcel lines. So they're, I don't know if they're all different property owners, but they're different parcels.
my point is we're gonna fill all the red squared areas?
Well, they'd be rezoned. Yeah. So what's allowed on all of those acres, yeah, is what we talked about what's in the public review draft. So that density, that height, all of those design standards would apply to any new development on those parcels. Okay, so it's not so great right now. Room for improvement.
No, I meant, what those choices there, we don't need to add anything, there's no parking there already, we don't need to add a track there. That's why I said nothing, there's nothing.
So the question is, what works? What's positive? What's good about these sites? What do you want to keep? Well, what works about this site?
What's positive? Is there something you can say that you like about these places? You don't like anything about them, that's fine.
I'd be happy to give you the negatives.
We're going to have
That'll be the
an
next.
opportunity. We anticipated that.
You wanna know what's positive as it is now? Or
Correct. What would you like to retain? What's positive?
Everything.
What works?
Great, so,
It's ideal.
The space.
That it gives you an opportunity to say, I don't want to see any change here at all.
Correct. No changes.
You can write that up.
I didn't get to put my 2 cents. Hold on.
yeah. Totally. Okay. Okay, so what's great is that there's parking. It sounds like everybody likes the fact that this place is accessible, that you can park your car. Great. I see that's walkable. Okay, there's... seems like maybe there isn't enough open space. Too many people, so maybe it's crowded. It's all paved. Okay.
I think you misconstrued it. You positioned it as, here are the 2 areas where we're looking at what's positive, and that may have made people believe that what's positive about those locations that you selected being developed.
No, how they are. This is how.
I know what you're saying, I'm telling you what the thought probably was.
Please change your answer if you misunderstood. We want to know what you like about these sites. Can we resend it?
Let's just, or you know, what we can do. I can just write some notes.
We
on
can write
this.
some notes. Tell us what you like.
I could reset it.
You can reset it?
I don't know if it's gonna be.
Let's just do it this way instead, and then we'll move on to the next. And we'll have a similar question about other sites, so we can keep in mind what we intended with that question. But if you wrote the wrong thing here and you want to record your real answer, let's do that now.
Decent parking,
So that there's parking. That's a positive.
it's accessible.
Good choice of stores. There's no what?
It's not noise sensitive.
It's not noisy.
But you can't see the pictures of an airport right there.
There's an airport right there.
It's noisy.
Because it's a commercial
A few
project,
times
it's
a
not
year.
noise sensitive.
Where do you live? I was close to Oh,
South side.
We already have a real impacted intersection at St. Cloud and Seal Beach
Well, that's a
Boulevard
negative.
with the existing traffic load. And
Traffic, yeah.
if you add 46 units per acre, you're going to have a lot of
That's 800
interaction
more.
between north and
600 more
southbound cars. And then that's going to spill over for the folks that are trying to turn west on St. Cloud and the people coming out going east on St. Cloud. And already they're having the right-hand turn 1 and 2 lane interference with traffic that's starting to move southbound on Seal Beach Boulevard. That intersection right there is going to be a problem.
If I could jump in, we will discuss things that you don't like too. But our goal here tonight is really to talk about what this zoning standard should include. There are many other moving parts on this, including revisions to the housing element. We are doing an environmental analysis and environmental impact report to support this work, which looks at traffic and things like that. But our goal tonight is really to get the feedback specifically on how this zone will be used to eventually, regulate development to the extent that we can. So what do we want it to look like? What do we want it to feel like? It may never be built, we don't know, but if a developer comes along, we want to make sure that the product that they put forward is something that we've done our very best to make it like we want to. So I understand that there are a lot of concerns about the housing element, but we really want to make sure that where we're headed with this zoning code is to do the very best we can to find a product that we like as much as we can.
And Alexa, if I can amplify that, and this is something that Monica mentioned in when she was talking about these new state regulations. Right now, if you don't have standards, objective design standards in place, right, the state law is going to dictate what you can take. Today, an applicant can come on this site, on any of the other sites that are along major commercial corridors, and under SB 6 and 2011, they can say, I can do as of right residential development as long as I meet certain requirements. And if the city does not have standards in place, I borrow the standard from the closest residential zone and I apply it. So this is an opportunity for you to get out ahead. Change in our urban environment is inevitable. There are things that we don't control as a city, as a community. Property owners have a basket of property rights that they may exercise in the future. In a private land ownership environment, that's what they do. And we look at the condition of retail stores today, right? Why is this important? Bed Bath & Beyond is gone, right? Ralph's and Vaughn's are going to merge. They've said they're going to close half the grocery stores in California. You may lose that pavilions. We can't control that. That's private enterprise. So the question is, do you get out in front as a community and develop standards that reflect your values and what you want the community to look like? Or do you wait for it to happen? And that's the choice. The choice isn't, I don't want change. The choice is, how can we come together as a community to shape that change? And we're asking you that question in physical form today.
Thank you. I do not disagree with what you said.
I think that my problem is that I was only given 4 options to pick from in terms of picking a structure that I thought would be appropriate to the community. I think perhaps if we had been given 10 or 15 options of design styles, the community may have found something that was more palatable. Your comment was that most of you like 2-story buildings. That's because that's what we're used to seeing. But if you, for example, one of those pictures was a Spanish-style building. To me, it looked like you picked it out of Mexico City and stuck it on a corner, and I don't think it belongs anywhere within the community. It doesn't just fit. But that was one of the options we had to pick as 1, 2, 3, and 4. I think if we'd given more options, you would have had a more positive result. That's just a comment.
That's an interesting comment, and what we want to make sure is that people say they don't like Spanish style. But we want to give the opportunity for people online, for people who may be less comfortable speaking in public, for people who would prefer to write their answers down, to have those opportunities. Because if it's just somebody who says, I don't like this, over and over again, we will never hear from the other voices in the community. And that's why it's so important to use these tools so as many people have an opportunity to put information on. And by the way, this does not close the conversation. This is not your only opportunity to give feedback. This is our first conversation with you. They'll be online, the public review draft is online. You can communicate with city staff on this. We're going to analyze this and give a report back. The report back will say, look, one of the things that's really important to the community is landscaping standards. We really got to nail the landscaping standards. Another thing that we see that's important to the community is height and bulk in relationship to the street. Okay, that's important. Maybe we make sure that from the street view, the design standards require a lower building in the front of the lot and maybe bigger buildings where you can't see them, so it doesn't feel overwhelming. See, we're looking for positive solutions to meet your concerns. It's good that you have these concerns. We need to hear them, but we need to hear them in a way that we can work with them.
I'd also like to add on to that. We see this as an opportunity for you to identify what you may like to see, or what's not right for the community. So when we show 4 buildings, we don't mean to imply that which one of these is right for your community. We mean to encourage you all to sort of tease them apart and sort of recognize the fact that there are all kinds of design elements that go into that project, and we can identify them separately and then tease them apart and think, okay, what would you like to see in the code? Not in a building because we're not developers, but in the code. Yeah.
Different cities that are around, they're in the same situation. And with these 2, why is the design boxy, ugly, and prison looking like? Where's the character to blend with the cities where the are? It's like a cheap way for the developer to go the cheapest route to make money. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the impression given repeatedly. So I'm not pointing fingers at you guys, but it's like, I don't know if it's the simplest route, the cheapest route, but they're up.
That's helpful. It's good. That's helpful to know how you feel about some of these contemporary designs that are boxy in nature. So noted. Absolutely. I'm sorry. Yes.
And we are absolutely trying to prevent the cheapest type of construction. That's what we look for in design standards. The reason we have to have these objective design standards is so that a developer can look at it, immediately understand what's going to be required of them, and then propose that to us. And we can look at their proposal and we can look at our objective design standards and say, yes, you meet it. And the goal of the state here with that legislation is to reduce the time it takes to get through the permitting process. That's the state's goal. So the developer knows what's expected and they can move faster. So that's what we're after here, is to make sure that we don't get just the boxes and the cheapest possible construction. So thank you for bringing that up. That's really important.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah, either. Yeah.
Preface my comments with the fact that Seal Beach Boulevard is the only north-south through street that this city has. That landlocks us into situations that involve traffic, and then to a lesser extent, parking, okay? Parking, parking, parking. If you don't have enough parking, you have a very unhappy neighborhood, okay? You just talk to the residents of Rossmore. I know you're trying to find something positive in all this, and I look at all of this, I look at the buildings and I'm thinking, too congested, that's not a positive. I see all these buildings as three-story buildings. What it's like to live in a three-story building. If the ground floor is your parking, that's one thing, and living is on floor 2 and 3. But if you have 3 floors for living, that's tough. That's very, very tough. Because now you got people going up and downstairs constantly, and it gets old real quick. So I look at those design standards, and if there's 3 stories, and that's 3 living stories, that's tight, that's too much. And yet, we're trying to see how much we can cram in. That's problematic. I don't care how nice you make it look, if we're all crammed in, it's problematic. There's a townhome development over in Cypress called Cypress Village. And their townhomes are in 8-unit blocks. So there's 8 units to one section. And they're 8 units, 7 are 2-story, the one at the end is 1-story. And they all have a detached garage. I don't see where having that much land is going to be something we can have in the future. But if you put the garage down below and then you have 2 stories for living, that is doable.
And so you're saying
What if
this is a
everybody
good
like this
example?
is into 3 stories for living is really not workable.
Am I hearing
Was-
you right that that's a good example? Cypress Townhome Village.
No, she didn't like it, I think.
That's a bad example.
It's the-
Avoid Cypress Village.
Here in the second row.
I also am interested in the parking. I noticed where I was living in Los Alamitos that they put up a big apartment complex, but the parking was not adequate. And that's terrible. You have to have, you have to have a place for your car and you don't want to walk a block.
I'd like to respond to that by saying we are not changing the parking standards. Some state legislation has limited, sort of put a maximum on the minimum parking you can require, but we're not changing those standards.
So whatever it is what it's going to stay.
What the parking ratio is, the amount of spaces per unit, we're not changing that. I wonder if we should continue.
Well, I was suggesting maybe we move to the open questions for people who are on.
Got it.
online, so
Got
they
it.
can write. Because look, we would like to talk about each one of these sites, but it's clear that as a community, you have general concerns. You're not particularly interested in specific sites, is that correct? Oh, then we can continue then if you'd like to talk about the specific sites.
Let's do
Are
that.
you finding that useful to talk about the specific sites? Okay, then let's go back and talk about the specific sites.
Great. Okay. Let's do that. And we will have time for hand raising. We will, but we have a few more slides. We want to document your responses.
And we also want to give an opportunity for people who are not comfortable saying something that may make them feel exposed. This is an emotional issue. So we want to allow people to have the opportunity to provide input evenly. But we'll certainly have an opportunity for an extended conversation. But before we do that, we really would like to encourage as much participation as possible.
So the next question, what do you want to see in these sites?
can say, no change.
No,
Oh, are we still on our phones?
Just, while you got that set up, I'm sorry. So you see Montecito Road right there at the back?
Yeah.
They have multi-story homes, current, state,
Yeah.
and the parking's underground, so when it rains, those guys don't park down there because they flood. I mean, that's what some of the issues that they don't want to see more developments like that happen where.
That's on my list, sorry, that's where I live.
Oh, okay. So I think what she's meaning is, build parking and then 2 units above where you kind of keep it ground level instead of underground parking. That's what they experience in that area right now, current state.
parking levels are flooded. Okay,
Yeah.
they get flooded. All right.
And then that street's packed with cars at that point,
Uh-huh.
and then you add more housing, then there's no parking at all for people. But anyway.
So the design standard should reflect the fact that it's floods. That's really important for us to know.
Got a high water table, and it
So-
floods.
Okay.
So that's really important input, because you can specify in the design standards that the parking is at a podium, right? So that it's not, a design standard might allow at-grade parking. It might allow tuck-under parking that isn't sealed off from the rest of the building. It could also, we see frequently here in Southern California, a half-story excavated. So we wouldn't allow that if that's a concern.
I can't, it's not bringing.
Excuse me, Monica. I think you misunderstood one of my prior comments.
Yes, please.
Where it says not noise sensitive. It actually is very noise sensitive.
The current uses are not noise sensitive.
But the space is, it's also, if you look at that picture over the dais, and you now see where the runways are, that's a high-risk area.
That's why when we talked at the beginning about the constraints, that we have to consider the local coastal plan, we have to consider the airport master plan, that's making there's a lot of moving pieces in here that we have to consider.
I just wanted to make sure that that gets into the consideration. Whatever they're gonna build there is going to endure a lot of noise and a lot of impact risk.
Right,
That's the
there
nature of
are,
that site.
right, residential uses within all our portions of the site needs sound attenuation measures. Right, that's in the draft.
Yeah, it's in the draft. It's also in our general plan and it's building code. But I mean, your point is very well taken. This is all of our sites have unique positioning where we're just our geography is very interesting. Yeah, but it's something not to lose sight of.
Okay, it's a little too small, so I'm gonna read them here. It's a lot of words. So we see a lot about landscaping, green setbacks. I see a lot of landscaping, more landscaping. So you like these sites to be landscaped if they're built out in the future. Some retail, parking, okay, two-story housing only, yep, we hear that. No cheap, high density, related to some previous comments we heard. Parks, accessible parking, absolutely. I think we talked about how the design standards for parking require that parking is visible and accessible, but doesn't dominate the street frontage. Okay, there's a lot of good feedback here. We're gonna digest it all. And we'll have a chance for you all to elaborate on these responses too.
So thinking about the housing types that we had shown, regardless of which one you liked or didn't like, or if you didn't like any of them, it's fine. What would be most appropriate, or what would you like to see? Would you like to see housing mixed with other uses like retail and office? Would you like to see multifamily buildings? Would you prefer to see it limited to townhomes? these are all the kinds of features that can be reflected in your design.
We'd also like to point out that, and this is true, all over California, that some existing shopping centers can be, you'll see there's a lot of parcels here, redeveloped over time to become more dense. New housing can come in on part of the site, not the whole thing, but it can start to build out. It can be treated as like infill development. It can become more dense. So imagine if there were a new multifamily housing development that would come in on part of one of these sites. Is there a certain configuration that you'd prefer, that you'd like to see? Just to start thinking about how, this is long range planning, right? To think about how it could start turning over time. Yes, ma'am.
Well, you're talking the whole parcel would be, that whole area would be the mixed use.
It would be, it would be rezoned, which means that,
So down the road, long time down the road, all of that commercial could be gone, and you could still have the mixed use, but the density would be massive if you had 46 per acre. Like Bed Bath & Beyond is gone, okay, we're gonna make that a 40-unit apartment.
So here's the,
It goes away, we're gonna make that.
here's the choice you're facing right now. Today, as we speak, the owner of the empty Bed Bath & Beyond can exercise their property rights under existing state law, and if they meet certain conditions, borrow the closest residential zoning standard. Right? If we don't have anything in place,
I understand that,
right.
it's just.
so what could we talk about and envision for the future so that we're ready as soon as we can be? Because I promise you, this property, I don't need to tell you if you live in Seal Beach, land in Seal Beach is valuable. People aren't going to let it and sit on it. So there's a little bit of urgency here beyond just standing and saying no.
Oh, I understand, I totally get that.
And so when we talk about the sites, so each one of those red lines is what's called a legal parcel. Now, they may be in common ownership, they may have, most likely what happens with shopping centers is that there may be more than one owner, and they have what's called reciprocal easements. So they have agreements to allow access for each other, right? So it might develop out in chunks, right? Someone might just take one parcel, or maybe a little out parcel is owned by somebody separately, and they might say, okay, well, I can exercise my rights to do residential development in the far southwest corner, that one little piece. I don't know what the store is there, but presumably there's something that maybe they could do that's more valuable. What goes there? Townhomes, multifamily, some kind of mixed use? That's our question.
Okay,
Go ahead.
so when you say multifamily, is that referring to apartments?
it could be apartments.
Right, I just want to make sure I'm understanding accurately. And when you say residential mixed use, is that a development that entails, could be townhome, could be apartment with some retail or with some office, this could be anything, right?
That's right.
That's right.
It's a very open-ended thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mixing, but not necessarily townhome or multifamily.
Is the goal to reach the 46 units per acre? Is that your objective? How many acres?
We don't have an objective. We'll allow 46 units an acre so that should a property turnover be developed, that property owner it can develop up to that density. Okay, so I can answer that.
Let me approach and answer a slightly different way. Our related project, the housing element, requires us to make certain assumptions about the sites in order to accommodate our RHNA, right, our housing allocation. So our housing element, the first version said, here's a site and we're going to have 400 units on it. And HCD's response was, no, you need to give us a lot more information and a lot more detail. So what our current draft says is that we assume half of the site would develop at up to 46 units per acre. Now, where we get in trouble is, let's say a project comes in and they say, and I'm getting way into the weeds here, sorry about that. If a project comes in and says, hey, we're going to build 20 units per acre, and then we don't get the units that we've said we're going to get in our housing element, we have to find another location for those units. So we need to do our very best to adhere to, to the sites that we've selected and make it as good as we possibly can, because otherwise we're going to be in this constant cycle of revising our housing element and looking for more sites, of which everyone in this room knows there aren't many. Well, we require minimum densities potentially. We don't allow for 20 units per acre. That's probably the easiest solution.
Yeah, at some point, you just don't have space.
Yeah.
So it's not like we have to provide this, okay, we're gonna provide it, where would you,
Yeah.
Okay, so, without getting too deep into this, we're working on a lot of housing elements, and we were recently at a conference where there was a representative from the Attorney General's office. And they were very open about enforcing housing element performance. They said, we're just gonna sue communities to change their zoning codes. So we wanna help you get ahead of that. We don't want you to be in a situation where the Attorney General comes and says you're out of compliance with housing element law and we're going to compel you to rezone something you don't want. That's what we're here to do.
there's cities right now that are in lawsuits.
Right. Yeah, and it's going to be more common. They have formed within the Attorney General's office a housing element strike force. And the first thing that they've said that they're going to do is that they are going to look at communities that are seriously out of compliance. So, serious. Now, I'm not telling you it's good, I'm not telling you it's bad. I'm telling you what we hear as professionals. So what we want to do is have some objective design standards in a mixed-use zone that can accommodate some housing. All you have to do is show the capacity that the housing could exist so that the hammer of the state doesn't come down on you, which is, I think, something you all can agree you don't want to have happen.
Right.
Please.
Okay. The appendix, and I'm quoting here, Appendix B on page 1, B1, says state law establishes a default density of 20 units per acre that is suitable for lower income housing in small metropolitan cities such as Seal Beach. Why are you considering 40 units per acre and looking at 400 units in that center?
A couple of things. The first of which is that the state actually sent us a letter and said we have to go to 30 units per acre, so it got worse. We need to get to our RHNA number. We do.
What kind of number?
Our regional housing allocation number, which is 1,243 units, and we have to provide a buffer. So we have to accommodate a lot of units. We have to show that we can accommodate a lot of units. Doesn't necessarily mean they'll be built. We just have to allow it, is what the state is asking of us. And we're getting really far off track. So I want to circle back and make sure that we're focused in on our zoning code and our design standards that we're looking for.
Okay, so the next question has to do with design standards on these two sites. So let's do that. What design elements are the most important in this area? Top three.
Yes, sorry.
I got kicked off. Could you give me the original passcode?
Do we have any more of the QR code?
Here's one right here at the podium.
Oh, yeah. So if you can. Oh, okay. This should take you right there. Do you have the number?
No, you have, yeah, it's,
You know what? I can find that.
Yeah. Let's,
Oh, there we go. That's right. He's got it. Yeah, we'll give you that 8-digit code here. Can you move the cursor, Andrew? Thanks.
okay. So is everybody in who needs to be in?
and,
Okay, so as these responses filter in, it's no surprise that building height is a really important design element to consider for this zone. It's also nice to see that the buildings to street relationship is important. That's something we have more control over, frankly. We can develop design standards so that we sculpt that relationship in a way that the community prefers. Building height, well, that's related to what we talked about earlier, which is accommodating this intensity, this density, the 46 units an acre, which is really not what we're here to debate. But all of these, but it's also helpful because then we know that we should look at design elements that sort of minimize that perceived height, like maybe step backs at upper stories, maybe roof heights, maybe building chunks that are smaller, buildings that appear in modules of smaller buildings. We can brainstorm about ways to minimize the perceived height. I'm glad to see the distribution of dots here. Usable on-site open spaces, that's not surprising because in the word cloud previously, we heard that landscaping and open space is important on these sites. Same with landscaping. Architectural style has a handful of dots. We do want to know what you mean by that. Is there a particular style you do want to see or you don't want to see? Or is that something we shouldn't regulate to begin with? This is very helpful.
Monotony,
Okay, yeah.
variation.
Mhm. I'm just going to jot that word down.
It'll look like the addition over there by Costco, where the rail station. I mean, it's just
Okay, let's move on to the next site. I think the next slide is looking at the next site. Okay, Seal Beach Plaza Village, down on the corner of Westminster and Seal Beach Boulevard. So this is in the corner of the Leisure World Development area. A housing element site, as you know. So let's think about. Let's start with what works. What do you not want to see change about this area? Or what do you appreciate about this? What should we keep in mind? You might say, okay, we realize this is, the property owner has some rights and this property may develop over time, but what should that property owner really keep in mind about what we love about this site and how it works in our community right now? Is there anything that may help sculpt these design standards?
Yeah, I think you could give me
Oh, advance. Yes, please. Thanks.
One thing, there's a north-south alley that runs all the way from Westminster all the way up to the street at the north end of that plot. And that could possibly eat access and even, provide for delivery side if you had the limited commercial. There are two gas stations in one spot almost. I mean, they're physically within a stone's throw of one another.
I'm glad you mentioned that. You know, when you think about the sites that we looked at in the previous slides, they're big. And I know there's a concern about parking and access and congestion. There's no reason that through alleys can't be incorporated into those site designs. Just to keep in mind, these are big areas, and we have to think about circulation and access and how to mitigate some of these problems. So thank you for that comment.
So again, things that we're seeing that are positive, that want to be retained, parking, that there is retail available, right? Trying to, again, the bad traffic, we're going to have the opportunity to talk about a variety of shops are important, that there are senior services access. These are all important things that are positive about this site, that should be retained in any future redevelopment. It's close to Old Town Seal Beach. Does anybody missing something that they'd like to say?
Yeah, we need the gas station to stay there.
Okay, so the gas station is a positive.
The gas station.
The gas station isn't within a red line, so I'm assuming it's.
Yeah.
Oh, if the gas station isn't within the red line, then we're not talking about anything happening. Just so you know, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to build housing on old gas station sites. The state will allow you to use them as potential sites in your housing. So don't have to worry about it transitioning into housing. You'll have the gas station. Can we go to the next slide?
Like
We are looking at 3 of these.
4.
Yeah.
We're going to run through this for one more site, and then that's it.
So what would you like to see in the future? I think we're short of restaurants. Good restaurants. They keep going out of business.
Yeah, Denny's went out of business. That side has to be restaurants for seniors.
We have an empty bank on the north end of that plot, and we have a row of shops that run north and south and face east, so that might be a option for your limited commercial, maybe with a backside of residential, high-density residential. In other words, take the row of shops and move them toward Seal Beach Boulevard. So you have room along that alleyway that runs all the way up to the street that feeds Leisure World's second opening there. I don't know the name of that street.
Or Southgate.
Are we gonna lose Roger Dunn's golf shop? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to inject that. So some themes come out about retaining the commercial character at this site, but also interestingly, senior housing is mentioned by a couple of people. So there may be opportunities keeping that in mind. Senior housing, retaining the commercial character in a mixed-use format. That's very useful information.
Already there.
Great. Let's move on to the next, where we can identify, types, housing types. It seems like retaining some commercial is a priority on the site, where you're really looking at Just commenting on what I see here and what I've heard, it sounds like retaining commercial is really important for the community on this site. So we see residential mixed use is the winner here. So that's helpful to hear, to see.
The world depends a lot on those shops along there. What shops? What shops are in? Jewelry.
Dollar store.
We joked about it, it's half the
Dollar
population.
General.
Yeah,
Post office
right.
is there somewhere?
Wells Fargo.
Great. Let's move on to the next one so we can think about a little bit more about the design features here. So top 3.
No, it wouldn't be good for families. There's no kids in.
Okay, so maybe senior housing? Right, but in the areas that are outlined in red there, on the housing opportunity sites.
That would not be a good place to have housing for families. There's just not enough room for them to be playing. She said senior. I know, I'm talking about when they're thinking about building a shopping center area. That would not be good for.
This is Dollar Tree.
I know, yeah, keep the stores there. Keep the stores where. That's not suitable.
Okay, so I see a big cluster around building to street relationship. So maybe that's getting to this gentleman's comment about moving the commercial up closer to Seal Beach Boulevard. Again, height, we understand that's a concern. Building massing, I'd like to hear a little bit more about specific concerns about building massing on this site. On-site open spaces and landscaping. So this is a pretty even distribution here. And there's no abutting low-density residential. So that makes sense why not too many votes for transition between new and existing development. This is very helpful. Thank you. Okay, we have one more site to look at. This is Seal Beach Center here in the center of town. So this is a housing element site. And let's hear about what's working for the site, what you don't want to change.
Yeah, PCH and Balsam.
How do you get in a restaurant?
I had trouble getting in.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
The first time I did,
Okay, so I see location. It's a very central location. I see traffic. It's very visible, very accessible.
It's walkable.
It blends with the Main Street development.
The grocery store and the size of the store, maybe not that particular company or organization, but, you know, where's your other large grocer that serves the neighborhood?
Right, so the convenience that the grocery provides at that location is very important.
And that
Right.
there's sufficient parking on the site seems to come up. as much as it's walkable.
It takes a lot. It relieves excess parking restrictions in Old Town. This serves as an overflow, because you can't park there.
It serves as an overflow parking for downtown.
Large parking lot. It's very useful.
Okay, great. Let's move on to the next. All right. Imagine the property owner wants to redevelop this site. What would you tell that property owner? What would you like to see?
Wouldn't this be a candidate for the LC combination once again?
The MCRHD. Yeah, it's not in the zoning code yet, but it's but it's the new zone. So all of these sites are identified as to be rezoned that new zone.
And then can you dictate a partition of how many of type A and type B?
I'm sorry.
Well,
You mean-
limited commercial and then the high density, type A, type B. Are you able to designate those two types in that zone that you're interested in?
What's type A and type B? I'm not sure I understand.
I think the style of facility you were showing, A, B, C,
Oh,
I think is
the development types. Well, no. If the zone permits 46 dwelling units per acre, that's the density. So when we see development that's at 46 units per acre, it takes different forms. It's really up to the property owner, the developer, to decide what they want to put there. But we can say, well, if you're going to do something that is 3 stories, you've got to have a gabled roof, and you have to provide balconies, and you have to make it look a certain way. You can't just do anything that's 3 stories or 4 stories. That's what we're doing here. Okay, if you're going to put 46 units to the acre, plus some commercial, some retail, we as a community feel it's very important that ground floor retail has some transparency and accessibility, and it's important that there is some shared open space, and it's important that you don't use this particular building material because it's so out of place, and we're going to put it on the prohibited list. There's a lot we can do to regulate what happens, how that 46 units per acre development, how it is expressed. There's a lot we can do to sort of dictate how it looks. So we're not going to say, oh, this type of development is okay, but that isn't. It's more, it's a collection of.
architecture, cosmetics, or whatever.
Can you be a little bit more specific?
Yeah.
This is kind of the first time we've seen
Yeah.
a series of choices like this. I don't know that Leisure World is going to be the predominant buyer, shopper there. So across the street, you have downtown Seal Beach. So the property owner has a basket of rights as to what they can do with it. You know, the public sector can't dictate beyond those basket of rights. What we can do is begin to talk about the shape of the building, how it addresses its neighbors, what its frontage looks like, whether it needs to have windows and doors, things like balconies, height, bulk, those sort of things. And those rules have to be consistent across the site. Now, the property owner can decide, maybe you're right, maybe the prime market for that is an extension of Old Town Seal Beach, maybe a little different than the shops at Rossmore. They'll make decisions about the types of units they want to, were they for rent, are they for sale? Property owner has that right in a society. Do they want to have ground floor retail? Who do they want to rent to? The property owner has the right. We can't tell them. We can regulate uses, but it has to be the same across the zone. So, for example, a grocery store is an allowable use, but we can't require a grocery store, right? If they for example, I'll give you an example in a community where I've worked in, a fitness center might want to come in. But that might not be an allowable use. You don't necessarily want that because it takes up a lot of parking and it, is not.
24-hour.
Yeah, so that might be something that ends up on the use table as requiring a conditional use permit or maybe is not allowed, right? But again, we're talking about an environment where property owners have a basket of rights. And there are limited things that we can, as a community, shape. And that's what we want to try and talk about. What can we shape and influence to get the best possible outcome for your community?
I'll give you one more example of one thing that we can shape, and we have shaped in the draft standards, public review draft. I'm over here because I'm using this mouse as a pointer. So here we've got lower, just on the north side of Bolsa, and over here we've got lower intensity development, right? That's single family. So one thing you'll see in the standards is that we've, in terms of like the building placement standards, the step back, we've said it's got to be pushed a little, not a lot, but a little bit closer to the PCH so that there's more breathing room here. And the upper stories of new development, should it be placed along Bolsa, well, it's got to be back, and it's also got to, the upper stories have to be stepped back a little bit to more closely mirror the scale of development that's happening on the other side of the street. And that's something that would be appropriate here, but not here. And we can write that into the standards. Of course, that standard is irrelevant for the development that occurs up at shops at Rossmore, but it's one way that we can be sensitive to the context here.
Why is it irrelevant for the shops in Rossmore?
Because it doesn't abut or face existing single-family development. That kind of
Target Center does. Yes, you've got Seal Beach houses next to Target.
Well, the broader point is that if it's a value to step back from single-family homes, that's the kind of standard that can be reflected. It's something that we've already reflected in the draft. I'll give you another example of something that exists now. I believe the loading for the grocery store is off Bolsa, right? So right now you have a circumstance where you have idling semi-trucks, right? So a design standard could talk about having a shielded truck loading, if that's something that needs to be in there. And that's the kind of thing that's reflected in the design standard that isn't there today. So that interface on the edge where the community, where the existing buildings, where the residential streets would meet new development, we can have standards that improve that condition rather than leaving it as it is today. Yes, please.
I just wanted to say, considering the proximity of parcel to Main Street, you guys should really look at the Main Street specific plan design standards to see how you can incorporate that into there so that it almost acts as an extension of Main Street, since Main Street is such a good example of good development.
That's very helpful, thank you.
I have two questions. So, does having the whole ground floor being retail, does that minimize the 46 units per acre, or they still can, even with retail on the ground floor, it's still 46 units per acre?
So there's some question of how you would do that. Again, you can have horizontal mixed use. Maybe there's buildings with stores along PCH, and then the housing steps back behind it, right? Or you could do housing over the stores. It depends on the configuration that the developer is always going to want to maximize the value of their land. So we can say, here's an envelope that you have to fit into.
So that being a 9-acre site, potentially the developer can come in and build 414 units.
If they can fit it. So there's a realistic capacity, right? Which is usually about at least 20% you lose from the building envelope, at least 20%.
But one thing we can't do is intentionally establish standards that prevent a developer from achieving that density.
I don't know if I should ask this now, but especially here, would there be, I mean, you'd have to go with the parking, and would there be any in lieu of parking? Like the city has now for existing businesses?
So we aren't proposing to change the parking standards that are assigned. So yeah, a developer would need to figure out how to park this.
Design standards for the parking, yes, but the amount of required parking, the spaces per unit, or the spaces per 1,000 square feet of retail, no. It's already in the code.
The existing code is what we're using.
What about the low and moderate low income standards in parking? One unit or one space per unit.
Yeah, there's nothing we can do about that. It's a state requirement. Yeah.
In other words, those 46 units, are you going to require X amount of low or moderate income?
At the moment, that's not proposed.
And any of these developments?
Not proposed for anything at this point.
What does that mean? It's not proposed at this point in time. Does that mean 2 weeks from now something changes?
Well, we are still in a certification process for our housing element, so we don't know what the state will come back with. At the moment, what the law says is that as long as we meet their minimum density, which for us is 30 units per acre, we can make some assumptions about affordability.
What does assumptions mean? What does that mean?
So now we're talking about the housing element, so we're on a new subject, but I will give you a little information about that. The housing element requires that you show the capacity. It does not require that you produce. It does not require a property owner to do anything, right? It needs to show that your zoning code can allow housing over a certain number of units per acre. The state uses density as a proxy or an indication that it would be possible for someone to develop lower income units. Nobody is compelled to. There's no standard that requires it. There is state law that a property owner could access that requires them to provide it in exchange for certain concessions and incentives. We don't have any control over that. What we're talking about here is not a housing element issue. It's indirectly because the housing element is going to require a rezoning of these sites to allow some kind of mixed-use commercial.
When you submitted your housing inventory, didn't you have to provide the number of units within each one of the income categories to the state?
Yes,
And then you.
and we made
had to
assumptions.
that by site, didn't you?
Yes, we did.
Okay, so it's.
And
not
that's in our
a
housing element.
Assumption.
Yeah, it's an
written
assumption
down
about the
in a document.
capacity that could fit there. Absolutely. It's proving to the state that you have the capacity. But that's a housing element issue. I'm sure we'll have opportunities to talk about the housing element again in the future.
I have one other question, and it's related to the density. You have not discussed the Navy property that's at the corner of PCH and the Boulevard, that they are proposing to develop. That's
Right.
what we were told at the Leisure World meeting.
That's correct.
Have you taken that density or that, and I'm going to be blank, okay? The shops at Rossmore affects me directly, okay? I back onto, or my building backs into Sprouts. That's where they're talking about putting 400 units, okay? Have you taken some of that Navy density and subtracted it? Because I notice on the land inventory in your housing plan, everything down here in Seal Beach is 30 units. As soon as you go north of the freeway, it jumps to 40. Are you taking any of that away with the addition of the Navy property that was up there?
The Navy property has always been in our housing inventory for 150 units. We cannot zone federal property. We are making an assumption about what is possible, and we are in conversations with the state to try to demonstrate that possibility, but we can't zone them.
I believe we have 2 more slides and then we're finished and we can proceed to the discussion.
Next slide. Yes. Yeah. There's a certain housing development type that you think is more appropriate for the site. Please indicate that here. Okay, so it looks like we want to preserve some commercial here. Great. That tells us we'll focus on the design of the non-residential component of a development for this zone. Okay, let's move on to the next. Okay, thinking about the site, its location in the city, its adjacencies, how you use it. What are some design elements that are most important in this area for this site? Great. So again, height and building to street relationship, these are really important. I like to see the cluster of dots on architectural style, and I want to know more about that. I think this distribution of dots is really helpful to us. I think we should move on to the next. So this is the end of the sort of targeted questions. Now, for the benefit of folks who are participating virtually from home, this Mentimeter slide allows you to submit any comment. And those will, of course, be recorded, and we'll take that into consideration as we develop the next draft. This equally, that's open to everyone here in person, but we would also like now to take an opportunity to address any questions that we haven't yet addressed.
Yeah, and particularly keeping in mind this notion about the design standards. So thinking about what we can control, which we can control how buildings are shaped and where they're located on the property. Let's talk about things you don't want to see. Let's talk about those things first. Let's get it all out there. What do you not want to see in terms of the physical characteristics of future development in the community?
Can I just ask a process question?
Sure.
On our first comments. So a lot of us did study the proposed zoning amendments, and we
Yeah.
have comments prepared and concerns, and we'd like to, questions we'd like to go through, and there's been a lot of the other stuff happening here. So is A, we're gonna do that in an orderly way, take comments and suggestions, and B, can we submit written comments and suggestions and questions?
You can absolutely submit written comments and suggestions.
I'm doing my best on order, but we got a lively crowd. So if you do have specific comments, we'd love to hear them.
Can you open the submissions?
Is the discussion questions?
Please wait or ask presenter to open.
Yeah, if you go back to the discussion, it should be.
It's not allowed.
Maybe the back arrow, I think, and then it'll open the last question up and allow.
And then show them and then choose.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's that.
Submit questions and comments, like, is there an email or supposed to be person reach out to?
Yeah, you can send them to me, or you can send them to Sean. Both of our emails on the website, but it's first initial last name at sealbeachca.gov. We do have an entire page on our website dedicated to the housing element, and another page that's dedicated to the zoning code update. And contact information is on there. There's FAQs, all kinds of things on there.
But, sorry, so you had specific comments on the public review draft?
I get to go first?
Yeah, please.
Oh, wow, okay, so, yeah, I did have,
Susie, would you go ahead?
First of all, let me just quickly say I know a lot of work went into the proposed zoning changes, and thank you for that. Obviously, a lot of thinking and research, and thank you for letting us come tonight to comment. I'd also like to say I like the idea of mixed use in Seal Beach. I think mixed use encourages kind of people to get out more and live and go to dinner in the neighborhoods they live in, and it can make a nice people-oriented, busy kind of social city. So I think there's potential there. A couple of things I am concerned about. So, you know, we're going to have thousands more people moving into existing limited public open space. So I'm kind of concerned about the impacts on public parks, on walks and beaches, dog parks, things like that. A lot more people, and we need, you know, public space to accommodate them, and also some transportation methods to get to those public spaces. And we're going to see, you know, more traffic, harder to get to parks, harder to get to the beach. So I'm just concerned about the impacts on quality of life, and I think when we design this, we should try and think about ways to mitigate that. Maybe with bike lanes, bike parking, parklets within these these mixed-use developments, so people can walk their dog and you know, just raise the quality of life in that little area. Also, the other thing I'm kind of concerned about is light space and shadowing. You know, one thing we like about our kind of low elevation profile in the city is that we get so much wonderful sunshine and fresh air and quality and light in our city. It's really wonderful to walk and live in that. So I am concerned about the 4 to 5 stories and those in the small setbacks that we're going to get this feeling of, you know, towering buildings, you know, shadowing us. It's just really not consistent with the look and feel we have here. And even I know one way to mitigate that you suggested is these step backs on the higher levels. That helps a little bit. But when I looked at the step backs you proposed, 6 feet for 4-story facing, street facing, and 8 feet at 3rd story for residential facing. But then when you add on the balcony, which can go into that space, so you get 8 feet minus 3 or 6 feet minus 3, it's kind of really still pushing everything right to the front, to the, you know, there's just not, it's just going to, I'm afraid, be a towering hulk. And yeah, we just don't, you know, I think we want to keep this, keep the design as open and family friendly and recreation friendly as we can. Thanks.
Hi, okay, as I said, I do live on the other side of the freeway, okay, and I back onto Montecito, and if you're not familiar, by the way, there's a good possibility Montecito is going to drop from a 2-lane street to a 1-lane street, because that's what Rossmore's looking at. I just came from a meeting last night on that. I have some concerns, especially about the density of 400 units going into the shops, Rossmore, particularly between Sprouts and our condos, okay? We have 52 units in our current condo. We are a 3rd-story, 3-story building on top of a garage, so they already do exist. And it's really not so bad as long as you have an elevator. But when you think about 400 units, we have 52 units. That's 8 times the number of units we have. For those of you are familiar with what's going up next to Costco, not townhouses there, but the ones that are behind, there's the hotel and the big apartments, okay. Those apartments, there's 251 units in almost 4 acres in that building. That gives you an approximate size, double that for what we're looking at almost. Okay, everything. There is a high water level in there. Our garage is almost always wet. We have flooded. And so I definitely would say do not allow underground parking for those houses. If they get too close to us, we have some units that will never see the light of day, because if you get to 5 stories, they will never see sunlight on the east side of our building. And like I said, parking is already a disaster in that area. Rossmore's screaming about it and everything, and it's all along Montecito. So just be aware of that.
Hi, Carol Churchill. I live in Rossmore. First of all, I want to thank you for doing all this hard work. I can tell you generally care about what you're doing, and it's really appreciated. I did look through your housing element. I did look through your zoning ordinance and scan through a little bit about the parking, so I'm sort of familiar with it. And I can see that you're trying really hard to make this the best you possibly can for the community under adverse circumstances. So I realize it's a lot of pressure put on you. And I'm sorry you have to go through it. You didn't ask for it. The state is making you do this. Okay, you're doing the best you can, and I wanted to know I appreciate it. I'm primarily here to talk about the shops at Rossmore and focus on that particular issue. And I want to advise you of what's going on currently, so as you do planning in the future, you can try and rectify some of the problems that currently exist. The lady who was here earlier lives in one of those buildings. But what's happening in the community is that the owner of the property is prohibiting the people who live in the Seal Beach buildings from using that area for parking. So those vehicles are now being parked in the residential neighborhoods in Rossmore. Also, I'm familiar with other people who've worked on this project for a number of years, and there's a high water table in that area, so underground parking would not be wise for anything that you plan for the shops at Rossmore, regardless of what the building height is. Okay, so if you want to make them 10 stories, you can't put underground parking there. It's going to flood and it'll cause a problem. You also have, and your staff recognizes this when you did your environmental studies, this entire area is a liquefaction area. So if there is a serious earthquake, there's going to be shaking, and there are standards for the height of buildings with regard to liquefaction. I'm asking that you look into that to make sure that whatever height you decide you go with, that it's consistent with proper building standards, so that if there is a major earthquake and there is liquefaction, that the buildings stand, because you have a safety issue. I think that's a demonstrable faction that you can take into effect. Currently, the parking within the existing Seal Beach units, there are not enough spaces for the units that are in there. So people who have maybe a 2-bedroom unit, and because of the pandemic, they're bringing in 3 generations into their home, they are parking not only their cars, but their kids' cars and their grandkids' cars while they're living in the unit. So you need to think about population density in addition to the number of bedrooms that you have. It's my understanding that a 3-bedroom house can legally hold 7 people. I think that's correct. A 2-bedroom house can hold 5 people. 1 bedroom can hold 3. And if these are adults that are driving, you need to think about parking. One of the thoughts that I had, and it may not work, you are the experts in this area, is that any development in the future that's going to not have underground parking, you should consider a parking structure. Look at it from the point of view as maybe it could be multifunctional, recreational use. Maybe you could get a donation from the developer for that land in lieu of a Quimby fee. Create some sort of recreational use on that site, which will also have a parking structure that could be blended in together so that the people that are living in these multi-family high-density units have recreation and outdoor space. Maybe it's not on the ground, maybe it's basketball courts, tennis courts, pickleball courts, whatever you want to put mixed in with parking in that area. That would take a lot of pressure off the people that live in Rossmore right now, because they would see that the parking is not in their neighborhoods and it's where it belongs with the housing that you're developing. I think those are all my questions. Again, I thank you very much for your hard work.
Question for Alexa. Do we have parking standards as far as if you have a one-bedroom, 2, 3, 4-bedroom unit, how many spaces you have to provide? Or is that now currently with the developer?
We have parking standards for all of our residential districts.
Okay, I'm talking about multi-story, like the Montecito townhomes built in 1970s as retirement homes, so they gave them one parking spot. Well, that's totally inadequate, because now, as she said, we've got many, many people, and they are parking in Rossmore because Montecito is all packed. So my question to you is, what are the parking standards for apartment buildings for 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever? What are the standards? Because the reason I ask this is the project that was planned for Lamson Avenue, and there they had 3 apartment buildings, and their parking was like 1.5 to 2.5, and that's not adequate, just not adequate. Because our concern was, they said, well, we'll park in the park. Well, you can't park in the park because it closes at sunset and it opens at sunrise. They can't park on Lamson Avenue. Where are they gonna go? College Park East? Don't want that. So my question to you is, what is it in the code for 1, 2, 3-bedroom apartments?
I do not know off the top of my head. I'm sorry, I have to look things up. But I can tell you that, I mean, Los Alamitos is a different city. They have different parking standards, and that particular project that you're referring to has a very high level of affordability in it. So there are changes that are required to be made in state law. And the same thing would happen here if we had a development come in with an affordable component, especially if it were a substantial affordable component, where we would not be able to require the same level of parking. It's just state law.
Well, that's something that needs to be taken into consideration for the surrounding area. Because just like Rossmore is currently enduring a horrendous parking situation, if that Lamson project were to be built, College Park East would endure it. Because there's no place else for these people to go. That's the problem. No place else. There's no surrounding area but us.
I understand what you're saying. I really do. And, you know, we're not proposing to deviate from our existing standards, and we can certainly take a look at them, again, as a part of kind of our next iteration here. But, yeah, there's things we cannot control.
This is critical, because right now, we have a traffic situation on Seal Beach Boulevard that is, well, it takes you forever to get out onto Seal Beach Boulevard on Lamson. Okay? Actually, what needs to happen is Lamson needs to be widened to 6 lanes from Seal Beach Boulevard down to Basswood Avenue. There's just that much traffic. And it takes forever to get to Boulevard. One of the things I was commenting to my daughter tonight was, when I go to the market, I go to the Vons over at Valley View. So why? Why? Because it's such a hassle.
Okay, Ms. Campbell, I know. But we need to talk about design standards right now, not about whether or not housing is allowed. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
So is there any way to, like, modify, the, new zoning codes parcel? Like, can you put a subsection in that, you know, for downtown, or what have you?
It would be a different code, if you will. So what we are trying to do is create a uniform standard. However, within this mixed-use commercial zone, we can have regulations that won't necessarily be impactful to all of the sites. The example of, if it's across the street from a single-family residential development, we can have a standard for that. Not all of these sites or not all of these, potential developments will be across the street from a single-family home, but we can have that standard in there for those that are.
And in here, it says it's 15 feet, is that correct?
Do you know off the top of your head?
Buffered to low rise, that sounds right.
It sounds right.
15 feet, I mean, the buildings that are in the Seal Beach Center right now, obviously there's parking and there's sidewalk, but that will put it obviously that much closer to the hill.
Right. So your comment is to be.
I mean, since really that's the only place there is, other than Old Ranch, but Old Ranch has the fence and the wall and everything, that to create a larger buffer
Okay.
to the low residential.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Okay.
Hi, thank you for this meeting and your generous amount of time. Patty Senecal, College Park East. Just had a couple observations in reading the zoning code amendments. Sure, I can talk louder. How's that? Is it better? Okay. In reading the zoning code amendments, I know we've talked a lot about parking, but it is silent in the mixed use about the new parking. And so I think it's really important, especially if you're doing commercial, and then whatever the housing ends up, that the commercial folks are going to need parking. Otherwise, people aren't going to come to use their businesses. And so I think in the updated mixed use part of your zoning code, I think it would be important to make the wishes known that we do expect parking and plenty of parking, and especially the commercial, the businesses, they need parking or they're not going to get customers, And so I think the other thing I did not see in the zoning, again, the mixed use zoning, that could be updated and that is public safety. I didn't see anything about setbacks to get fire trucks in and police cars or ambulance. There wasn't a section in terms of public safety. So I think that could be important. We need to make sure we can get fire trucks through all these, because these buildings look very tight. And so I want to make sure we can get our first responders in. The other thing is traffic congestion. We are backed up now on St. Cloud. We get off the freeway. It's just a total cluster there, and getting up and down the boulevard. And last year, come around November, I just didn't even go into Rossmore Center because it's completely backed up. All the left-hand turn lanes, back up the middle lanes, very unsafe. And so I think when we talk about adding housing and looking especially at mixed use, there needs to be something in the zoning that talks about we cannot impede traffic flow. Our general purpose lane needs to flow. I don't know how you can mitigate that, but I think we really need to make sure we're not impacting public safety with cars that are constantly stop and go, stop and go, stop and go. And then otherwise, again, they're going to be going over to the overflow streets around the shopping center, which we've already heard a lot of discussion about that. So it's very complex. Really appreciate the amount of time and that you guys are looking at this. But I just want to reiterate, public safety, especially for us in College Park East, we have one way in and one way out, and that is it. And we talk about, being able to get first responders in, fire trucks, ambulance, to where we live. And if that boulevard and Valley View continue the amount of congestion, it puts us at risk. And so again, we just want to make sure there's traffic studies and that in your zoning code, there's some standard for flow and that we're not overly, any more impacted than we already are now. So thank you for this consideration. Thank you for your time.
No, just a question for Alexa. Is your public safety element, do you need to do an update on your public safety element too?
We do need to update the safety element. Yeah, and park traffic flow and things like that, those standards typically exist in the general plan. There may also be, as associated with the environmental impact report, there could be mitigation standards that are implemented. So those are the types of documents where we would see those relationships to traffic flow.
Yeah, I would just say, adding context, this is all got to be consistent with the elements of the general plan. So the city will need to, every city in California right now is going through a process of updating their safety elements, so.
And I would also add any new rights-of-way in new development that the standards don't dictate the width, the radius of the turning movements. Those would be the city's engineering standards, the right-of-way width.
I just had a question. What happens to these standards if you have a density bonus situation? Do they exceed the heights? Do they exceed, I mean, what happens if you have that happen?
So you've asked the question that everybody should be asking, and the answer is the city cannot use the applicant will be entitled, if they meet certain conditions, including providing senior housing and providing certain thresholds of affordable housing, will be entitled to a 35% density bonus along with what are called concessions and incentives, where they can choose to supersede elements of a municipal zoning code by the applicant's choice. So I wish I could tell you that we have an answer for you on that, but that's again a circumstance that is in effect throughout the state.
That's like development fees and setbacks, all that can be affected.
Not the fees, but things like setbacks or other kinds of
And
requirements.
isn't it like 50% in some cases now? Or?
It
Well,
could be.
Yeah, again, you don't have a high-quality transportation zone in the city? We don't. Okay, you're safe from the bigger extent. Things change every time the legislature meets. I wish I could tell you that it's going to stay the same. I don't know.
And one thing we can't do is predict what those concessions will be, right? So the developer identifies a standard that they can't meet in order to achieve, to get those affordable units. And it is.
Throughout this whole process of what you guys have been doing, have you talked to developers that would be interested in developing, and what are their units per acre?
We talked to developers, not necessarily associated with these sites, but we talked to developers that were local or that knew something about these sites to get feedback and get input. Not surprisingly, some of our sites are challenging, and they recognize that. So I'm trying to remember, Monica, was there anything really specific about what they could or couldn't do? The exchange we had with them was, more is better, right? Because that's how you achieve your economy of scale.
Yeah, and that's the major takeaway, that in order for any development to pencil out, the density has got to go up and the height's got to go up.
And you talk into the microphone. Units per acre in some of those sites?
That's part of what we are doing is testing that assumption and kind of trying to map it out like you would as a developer. Okay, let's assume we have we've got these kind of setbacks and we have these kind of open space requirements. Can we get to that standard? Because we do have to have that discussion with the state in terms of our housing element. It's part of how we prove our sites can accommodate what we say they can. We have to take those things into consideration. And It doesn't matter. We can set standards, about minimum sizes or things like that. And so if that's something that's important, that's a great comment to give. But we would anticipate a mix which, especially when you're looking at apartments, is pretty common. Right. Yeah.
In terms of what type of developments that can occur, we had a choice about a townhome, a multifamily, or mixed use. But within the mixed use, can we dictate apartments only or townhomes only, or is that up to the developer when it comes to mixed use?
And physically, what ends up happening is if you were to do townhomes and commercial and a mixed use, it would be what we would call horizontal mixed use, which means that the uses are next to each other. So you'd have maybe like or you could have, in a townhome, you could also have things called live work. So the bottom floor could be like an office or workshop for somebody. That's kind of how a townhouse would work in a mixed use development. If you went to a multifamily, then you'd go to a little bit more vertical mixed use configuration, where that ground floor might be stores or offices, and then units above. So that's kind of, again, what would fit on the site.
Yeah, I hope that those questions weren't misleading. We can't say no townhomes on this site. The intent was to sort of look at all of the elements that gave that building its character or lack of character, and help everybody identify, oh, maybe it's the roof form, maybe it's the setback, just to think about how buildings come together and what we might want to see or not see.
Well, the nature of my question has to do with the fact that, for a lot of us homeowners here, it makes a difference whether the building next to us is a condominium townhome type situation or apartment building where a bunch of renters, right? Where you have stakeholders living next door to you, or you have renters living next door to you. That's the nature. It's not really how they would actually develop it.
So that's again going to be determined by the market, what the demand is. Yeah.
Developer. There's no way we can write it into the future code. Thank you.
I'll also say that people do rent out townhouse, build townhouses as rentals. So the form doesn't guarantee the ownership.
In a HOA situation, there's always a fund that will maintain the property versus if you have a kind of a, low rent kind of a, apartment owner.
I will say that the land values in Seal Beach are so high that you're not going to see a lot of inexpensive housing built easily. The housing that gets built in Seal Beach, left to market forces alone, is not going to be inexpensive.
I just have like a concept question. To the extent that low-income houses are built, and I've been working with tax-subsidized low-income housing for a number of years, and with the tenants that live with them and with management. And the gentleman brings up a very important point. It's not the type of building or even the individuals that live in it that are low income. It's the management of the building. It's the failure to provide adequate trash pickup, to deal with tenants that leave on a regular basis because they leave furniture and mattresses and appliances out in the alley because there is no regular way for them to dispose of property when they move. It changes the character of the neighborhood if the design of the building doesn't take that into consideration, if it's going to be apartments or if it's going to be owned. Because the problems with the apartments are the management doesn't provide adequate security. People's cars are broken in because they're rentals and they don't give them garage spaces that close. They drive into areas that are just like open spaces. So that requires the police to come and take reports. A lot of these apartments have large parties, so they're very noisy, so you have calls to the police department on these rental issues. The trash disposal is always a problem. Sometimes the managers of these apartments, they may manage thousands of units in an area, but they have a live on-site manager. The manager doesn't hire adequate staff to keep the elevators running. I know of one instance where you had 4-story buildings. The elevators were out of use for like 4 weeks. And you had seniors and disabled people that were living in these rent-subsidized apartments who didn't have any way to get down the stairs because they had to use the elevator. And the response of the management was, find somebody to get your groceries for you. So management in apartments and low income is really important. I don't know if that has anything to do with design, but if you can provide adequate trash pickup, adequate parking, adequate security entrances into the buildings that they can be locked, that would cut down on the need for outside security, and it would really improve the quality of life for all the other landowners around those apartments, as long as it's managed properly. Thank you.
You can, I believe, incorporate designing standards that she's mentioned into these options, these variations of standards that apply to different situations, including different types of structure, different even marketing. So you could have conditions of approval that might incentivize various types of management, even the way the properties are marketed.
Not necessarily. What the state is asking us to do is to provide options for housing to be developed by right. So there would not be an opportunity for further review. That said, I've worked in the affordable housing space before too, and so it's nice when you can have a little skin in the game. So you know, there's tax credits from the state, but typically the county gets involved in things like that. And you know, if it were truly an affordable apartment complex, there's a lot of layers of negotiation and things like that that go in to speak to those exact things like upkeep and maintenance and those types of things. But in terms of the zoning code isn't used to regulate how often trash is picked up or something like that. There are other pieces of our municipal code that are, and that's where code enforcement comes into play to enforce those things. There is no conditional use permit associated with these projects. We have to allow them by right.
What I'm suggesting is you might be able to incentivize a better quality project, even if it's not affordable. It still helps you meet your density requirements, your units that you need, so that you don't have to have them all affordable. You can incentivize projects that aren't affordable, perhaps, that might mitigate against some of these problems.
That is, I'm trying to figure out the word.
You might be able also to incentivize master planning by aggregating some of those smaller parcels along the Seal Beach areas, the 2 areas on north of the freeways.
The state absolutely encourages kind of parcel assembly and things like that for better projects.
And you could do that with, who knows, even density. Perhaps the same density that development might get with affordable housing. You can incentivize with market rate housing by properly writing those opportunities into the zone.
The state is very much pro-affordable housing, so if we were to take action that makes it seem like we're trying really hard to not have affordable housing, we're no.
Would there be many benefits to the whole community to have a master plan assemblage of those multiple parcels along Seal Beach Boulevard?
So a master plan typically is discretionary, and it's not legal to have discretionary review of residential development in the state any longer.
Not, well, if it meets your housing unit goals.
So it's not legal to have any discretionary review on housing in the state of California.
The current draft, do we we actually have height limits for these future developments?
Yeah, we do.
Like what, 5-story?
We had 4 and 5, 4 in the coastal zone and 5 north of the coastal zone.
From this meeting, would any of that change? The heights?
I'm sorry?
Based on the meetings and stuff, would any of the height restrictions or height limits change or could change?
I feel like I say this a lot at all the meetings. Anything is possible as long as we can make it work. So, I mean, we are definitely hearing loud and clear that, you know, the desire is to keep the height to, you know, lower standards. And that's part of the testing that goes on. You know, can we stick to a lower height level and still get the units that we need? If we can't, then what are the alternatives? Like has been discussed, the step back. So you've got 2 stories that are here, and then you know the next story doesn't start till here. So the view shed and the view line and you know the sunlight and all those great things that everyone brought up, you know, we can mitigate in that way. So those are kind of the conversations that we get to now. Okay, if we can't have everything be 2 or 3 stories, what can we do to make it a little more palatable, a little bit better, a little more meeting the hopes of the community?
I'd also like to add on to that, you know, what can we're accommodating not just the 46 units an acre, but that amount of housing and the parking that we want for those units. So it's the structured parking, however parking is developed. I mean, that's also in that height limit, right?
So there's always trade-offs. One of the things we heard loud and clear, particularly, is to keep heights low where it impacts the street. So these are pretty big parcels. There'll be an exterior and an interior. And so that gives us some creativity to think about maybe when your experience walking down the street, it feels like a smaller building, but the interior might be where there's more space gets shifted. We've heard about sunlight, which we've already considered in here about keeping open space, view sheds, light planes. Those are all already in those objective design standards. So it's kind of baked in some of that thinking. But at the end of the day, Alexa's right. We can't put in standards that make development infeasible.
About what?
Infeasible.
Can I ask one more crazy question? Have you looked into modifying the Main Street specific plan to do mixed use 2nd or 3rd floor?
That's in our current housing element draft, yeah, that we are proposing to amend the Main Street specific plan to allow residential uses on the 2nd story.
We'll come back and talk with you about that in a few months.
The environmental impacts and mitigation of those considered to be obstacles or discretionary conditional conditions that developers are exempt from or can't.
So the housing element, and now we're in the housing element world, and I think also this will need an ISMND, right, for adding a new
No,
zone?
we're actually doing an EIR.
In EIR, so there will be an
So
environmental, yeah.
the environmental analysis. So there, yes, there.
If again, we're talking about the actual probable impossibility of building affordable units, where a developer is required to properly mitigate the impacts, which might include, who knows what, for traffic, for example. If you can't get affordable housing under any circumstances by mitigating the impacts, that again maybe suggests the possibility of incentivizing the densities you're looking for with a developer that can actually afford to do so.
I'm not sure I follow the comment. Could you?
Why are we assuming that we've got to have some affordable, or that some developer's going to demand by right affordable housing units? Because we are ignoring the impacts that a project like that might have, and the fact that he's not going to be able to mitigate those impacts.
So a couple of things. A housing unit is a housing unit is a housing unit in terms of CEQA. Who lives there and what their income is isn't part of the analysis. But as was mentioned, our land values are really high and construction is expensive. It's very likely, based on the market alone, that we would have market rate housing units. However, state law requires that we do some analysis to show that affordability is achievable and possible. And we do have to identify units on each site per state law of what we think is a reasonable assumption under their guidelines for affordability at that site. It doesn't mean it will get built. It doesn't mean anything will get built.
So that would be a condition of the developer to provide a certain percentage or number of affordable units, right?
Some communities have those types of standards. We do not right now.
Right, many communities are, as a condition of approval of their housing elements, and now we're far afield. Well, no, of the state approving it, requiring what's called an inclusionary housing ordinance. Seal Beach currently doesn't have one, but many communities in Orange County are in the process of composing an inclusionary housing ordinance, which is essentially a requirement to provide below market rate units as part of a market rate development. If it's a rental project, then their state law allows communities, well, actually requires communities to offer a alternative form of compliance, which is usually a fee in lieu. But as of now, as of now, Seal Beach does not have an inclusionary housing ordinance.
And I don't think we would want one. Especially if you can incentivize. Why not give a developer who's going to build market rate housing the same kind of density bonus, for example, that you might to an affordable housing?
Density bonus is under state law. It's not something we offer special as a city. It's state law what they can do. Yes.
Question, when you are doing your traffic studies, are you timing in different times of the day, especially around 8 o'clock-ish and 4 to 5 o'clock-ish, how long it takes to get from Seal Beach to LaSalle Medical Center specifically?
I would not be comfortable answering that question. I'm not a traffic engineer. But typically, kind of there are standards. Looking at peak traffic hours and those types of things is very common. But if you would like to reach out to our Public Works Director, she could give you a much better answer, and I can give you her email.
Because that's, I worked. I'm an ex-ER nurse, so I know time is life. And the more people you put along that corridor, the more traffic you're going to have, the longer it's going to take to get from point A to point B, and somebody's going to die doing that.
And I would really encourage you to keep an eye on our EIR progress, because we will have a lot of public outreach and time to review the studies and those kinds of things. So I would definitely encourage you to keep an eye on that on our website.
Sign in over there.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You have a thankless job, by the way. I mean,
No, I mean this sincerely. I really appreciate all of you coming out and helping us through this process, because your input is really important. And I think we are coming out of tonight with some really good feedback and things that we can, take a look at going forward, and what can we do to adjust what we've got and try to get to the best possible outcome. Thank you.
I have to say, I was at the LaSalle City Council meetings when we were going through a lot of this discussion. I wish they could come here and see how well you all have conducted yourself.
Here,
How
here.
brilliantly you guys have been. with being so open-minded and your willingness to listen and things like, because they were absolutely horrendous. I've never seen a more unprofessional group in my life. It was unbelievable. And it's like, this is the example of how things should be done.
Yeah.
Because they're unbelievable. I mean, their mayor was just like shocking with her rude comments after votes were taken and things like that. Very inappropriate. So, but I appreciate your willingness, though, to communicate and listen to everybody.
Thank you very much. I really do appreciate that. And I appreciate your patience as a group as we went through the more formal piece, because that lets us get everybody, shy people, active people. We wanted to get to this conversation, but we needed your patience to go through the formal part first. So thank you.
Joe.
I just wanted to mention, though it has not come up in this meeting, that there have been questions about legal challenges to the state. And I would just point out that at this point, there have been no successful lawsuits against the state. And the organization called OCOG, Orange County Council of Governments, sued SCAG, which is the agency that dispenses the RENA numbers. They lost 2 lawsuits, and just yesterday I was informed that the appeal to the California Supreme Court to hear it was rejected. So, you know.
Is Huntington still ongoing?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it
They're
is.
gonna, you know.
They'll fight that till the end.
Yes, they've unleashed their elected city attorney to deal with that.
It takes a city that size to fight the state.
Yeah.
So, my point is that I think that
Yes.
what I see happening here this evening is the most positive way to deal with this. There are certain realities that we have to deal with.
Right.
And if we
That's
work
true.
within those confines, you know, again, nothing ever may be built. Our 1,243 required housing units may never be built.
That's, you're right, because you've got to have somebody be willing to sell their property.
Right.
You have to have somebody be willing to buy it, then you have to have a builder willing to
Exactly.
build it.
So this is not a time, you know, to panic about when are the bulldozers coming. I watched the Leisure World Town Hall, and after the entire 2 hours, a lovely lady got up and proposed, you know, had some questions, and her last question was, when are they gonna start building? You know, that's,
Well, they have to vote too.
well, it's,
And
in
that's
other words,
another layer.
our city does not build anything. You know, if we own lots of property, city property, you know, then we have certain things we can leverage and ask builders to do or not to do, or, you know, more control. This is a question of private property, and the state is very, very adamant about not only showing the number of units, but what are you gonna do on that property? You know, don't just tell us, yeah, we're gonna zone this for 150 units, you know, what are they gonna look like? How are you gonna get there? And we keep hearing different members of HCD giving different opinions to different cities. And then we have one more layer that we haven't mentioned, is that we have the California Coastal Commission, which has a big say-so in all of this, because, you know, out of our 1,243 units, the Coastal Commission wants us to leave the coast now.
Yes.
So, although there is I just heard there's a new, one of the new bills that there's like every day, there's 30 of them.
Something else.
That they've made a decision, I think that HCD supersedes the Coastal Commission.
Yeah, so just for your reference, SB 330, SB 330 or 35?
I thought it was 30.
35. 35, which was supposed to sunset, is now extended indefinitely, and it used to not apply in the coastal zone. It now applies in the coastal zone. So that's the change. So we've been operating under 35 for about 8 years. And, yeah, a few years. So it was supposed to sunset in 2 years. I think it was supposed to be a 10-year program. It's now been extended indefinitely as of last Friday. And it used to not apply in the coastal zone, and it now applies in the coastal zone. So that's the change.
And unfortunately, well, the fact is that our coastal zone extends from the ocean to Westminster Avenue.
Wow.
So that's all of Old Town and the Hill and Heron Point.
Yeah, I think we had 56 or something like that housing bills signed by the governor last week. So we were on a webinar today. We're still trying to digest all this information. What does it mean? But yeah, the state is staying the course on their policy for housing development.
So many people are leaving the state. It's like, that's what I don't get.
Well, but
It's like,
think about it.
60% of our state.
What's our population, 40-some million?
Yeah.
And if
You know, it's like, what about all that land out there between here and Vegas? Develop that, you know? It's like, yeah.
We can go down a rabbit hole there. I know. Again, thank you very much. I've got two of our other planners here, Marco Cuevas and Sam Funes. Sean and I are here. You can reach out to any one of us at any time. Send us your comments. Please send us an email if you have other things you want to contribute to this conversation so that we can keep this path moving forward and, again, do our best to design as well as we can. If you didn't sign in, we would very much appreciate a sign in. And then there are also comment cards for this evening there. If you wouldn't mind filling out one of those, that would be great. Thank you all very much.
Are you going to get email on the website?
I'm sorry, what?
Your email?
Yes. Yeah. On the housing element page, on the zoning code page, yes.
Thank you.